Welcome to TalkTreatises, the deep dive edition.
It is great to be back.
We are, as always, cutting through the noise, going past the headlines, and getting right to the source of some of the biggest, most, I guess you could say, enduring ideas in history.
We take the texts themselves, the original sources, and we really try to extract the gold for you.
And today, we are tackling a genuine giant. I mean, this is a big one.
It's a huge one. We're doing a deep dive into one of the most famous, one of the most quoted, and definitely one of the most controversial texts in the entire history of political philosophy.
We certainly are. We are looking at Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France.
And right away, I can hear people thinking, okay, political philosophy from 1790, is this going to be dusty? Is it going to be dry?
Is it just for academics?
And the answer to that is, well, it's a resounding no. This text is a lot of things, but dry is not one of them.
Not at all. It's a polemic. It's a scream.
It's a prophecy. It's basically a letter that was written in a kind of fever pitch that ends up predicting the future with, frankly, terrifying accuracy.
So our mission for this deep dive is, I think, pretty specific. We really want to get past the bumper sticker version of Edmund Burke.
Mm-hmm.
You know the one I mean, the caricature you might get in a history class where he's just this grumpy old conservative yelling at clouds.
Right, or a bootlicker for the king and queen who just hates any kind of change. Edmund Burke, the original buzzkill of the Enlightenment.
Exactly. That's the popular kind of watered down view. But when you actually read the text, and we've gone through the reflections and crucially some of his earlier speeches on corruption in India, you find something so much deeper.
So much more profound. You find this prophetic warning about what happens, what really happens when a society tries to completely erase its own history to build some kind of utopia from scratch.
The hook that really grabbed me, and I think it's a great way to frame this, is an analogy. Imagine you're standing on your front lawn. You look across the street and your neighbor's house is on fire.
It's blazing.
But here's the strange part. Everyone else on the block is cheering. They're popping champagne. They're dancing in the street.
Celebrating the fire.
Yeah, they're shouting, look at that. That was such an ugly old-fashioned house anyway. It had drafty windows and terrible plumbing. It's going to be so much better when it burns down and they can build a new one.
They're so confident in the renovation that they're cheering on the demolition.
Exactly. But you're the only one standing there, arms crossed, and you're not even looking at the flames anymore. You're looking at the sparks. And you notice that the wind is picking up and it's blowing those sparks right toward your own roof.
And the people celebrating?
The people celebrating have absolutely no idea how to build a house. They've got a blueprint they drew on a napkin 5 minutes ago, but they have never laid a single brick in their lives.
That is Edmund Burke in 1790. He is the man watching the sparks while the rest of the intellectual world is just mesmerized by the fire.
So let's set that historical scene properly before we dive into his arguments. It's 1789, it's 1790. What is the vibe in Europe? What does it feel like?
The vibe is electric. It's euphoric. I mean, you really have to put yourself in the shoes of the intellectual classes in, say, London at that time.
Right.
The French Revolution was seen as the dawn of a new age. The Bastille has fallen in July of 1789. The king, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, have been forcibly moved from their palace at Versailles to Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And in England, the poets, the philosophers, the progressives, they are ecstatic.
They think this is the best news they've heard in decades.
Absolutely. They see it as a triumph of reason with a capital R. They think France, which had for centuries been this bastion of absolute monarchy and, what they saw as backward superstitious Catholicism.
The old enemy.
The old enemy was finally catching up. They're comparing it to their own history, specifically to their glorious revolution of 1688.
Okay, so that's the key comparison for them. 1688 was when England effectively kicked out a Catholic king. James II brought in William and Mary and established a constitutional monarchy.
A Protestant constitutional monarchy. So the British liberals and reformers are looking across the channel and thinking, fantastic. The French are finally having their 1688 moment. Liberty is on the march across Europe.
Welcome to the club.
Precisely. They think it's just a copy-paste of their own success story. And this right here is where the trouble starts for Burke. Because everyone, and I mean everyone, expected him to be leading the parade.
And why was that? Burke was a Whig, correct? He wasn't some reactionary Tory.
Exactly. The Whigs were the party of reform. He had spent his entire career fighting for the underdog. He supported the American colonists' grievances against the crown.
A very controversial position at the time.
Hugely. He fought for the rights of Irish Catholics. He spent years, decades even, fighting against corruption in the government and in the empire. So his friends in the Whig Party, people like Charles James Fox, they thought, Edmund is going to love this. The French are overthrowing a tyrant. This is right up his alley.
But he wasn't on board, not even a little bit. And the specific trigger for him writing this massive book wasn't just the news from France. It was something that happened right there in London.
A sermon.
The famous sermon at the Old Jury.
Which was a meeting house in London, not a synagogue, just to be clear.
Right.
Yes. On November 4th, 1789, a man named Dr. Richard Price gives this fiery sermon to a group called the Revolution Society.
And who was Dr. Price?
He was a dissenting minister,
right,
a radical thinker, a moral philosopher. And in this sermon, he basically lays out the argument that the French Revolution is the ultimate fulfillment of English ideals. But he makes a very specific, and for Burke, a very dangerous claim about the King of England.
What's the claim?
He claims that because of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the people of England have secured 3 fundamental rights. 1, the right to choose their own governors.
Okay.
2, the right to cashier them for misconduct.
Cashier them. That's such a striking word. It sounds like a retail term, but it's actually military, isn't it?
It is. It means to dismiss with disgrace, a dishonorable discharge.
So fire them.
Fire the king. And 3, the right to frame a government for themselves. Price is essentially saying, the king works for us. We hired him. And if he messes up the order, or if we just don't like his performance, we can fire him.
It sounds like firing the manager of a fast food joint. You messed up the fries, you're cashiered.
That is exactly how Burke heard it. He was absolutely horrified. He reads this sermon and he sees this Revolution Society in London sending these fawning congratulatory letters to the National Assembly in Paris, acting like they speak for all of England.
And he sees them treating the violent overthrow of a 1,000-year-old institution like it's a book club meeting.
Yes. There's this sense of frivolousness that just drives him insane.
Yeah.
So Burke snaps.
He snaps.
He sits down to write a response. It starts as a private letter to a very young gentleman at Paris, a man named Charles Jean-François Dupont, who had written to Burke asking, what do you, the great reformer, think of our glorious revolution?
And Burke starts writing, and he just doesn't stop.
The letter just grows and grows and grows. It becomes a treatise. It becomes a manifesto. And finally, in November of 1790, it's published as Reflections on the Revolution in France.
So if we had to boil down the central thesis of this massive, sprawling, passionate book, before we really get into the weeds, what is the absolute core message?
The central argument, the heart of it all, is that society is an organic, complex inheritance. It is not a machine you can just take apart and put back together.
It's not a Lego set.
It is not a Lego set. Burke argues that freedom, when it's divorced from wisdom and virtue and restraint, isn't liberty at all. It's madness.
Freedom without wisdom and virtue is not liberty. It is madness. That is a heavy hitter right out of the gate.
It's the core of his anxiety. He believes that by tearing down all the old institutions, the church, the nobility, the monarchy, the whole social fabric, the French weren't liberating themselves. They were removing the only things that kept human passions in check.
The guardrails.
All the guardrails. He argues that you don't get a rational paradise when you strip away tradition. You get a vacuum.
Yeah.
And something terrible, something much worse, will rush in to fill that vacuum.
Now, before we get into the specifics of his arguments about France, I think it is absolutely crucial that we establish Burke's credibility here.
Yes.
Because I can hear the skeptics and, our listeners thinking, okay, but isn't he just defending the rich and powerful? Isn't this just a sophisticated argument from a sycophant for the aristocracy?
That's the standard critique, and it's a powerful one. Karl Marx famously dismissed Burke as nothing more than a paid shill for the ruling class, someone whose ideas were just a fancy justification for oppression.
Right.
But we included another source in our stack today specifically to counter that idea, and that is the speech on the Nabob of Arcot's debts.
This is from 1785, so this is a full 5 years before the Reflections.
Correct, and this is vital context. If you only read the Reflections, you might walk away thinking Burke just has this abstract love of power and authority. But if you look at his work on India, you see a man who spent nearly 2 decades of his life prosecuting corruption within the British Empire.
He wasn't defending power, he was trying to hold it accountable.
Ferociously so.
So let's unpack this Arcot connection, because it sounds like a financial thriller, but it's really about the abuse of power. This wasn't just a little skimming off the top. This was a massive, systematic scheme.
It was gigantic. You have to understand, The East India Company wasn't just a business. By this point, it was the de facto ruler of vast parts of India with its own army.
A corporate state.
A corporate state. And it involves a local ruler, the Nabob of Arcot. And the core of the scandal was what Burke called the fictitious debts.
So what were they?
Burke exposes this incredibly complex system where British officials of the East India Company and the Nabob were colluding. The British servants of the company, guys like Paul Benfield, claimed that the Nabob owed them massive, astronomical amounts of money. We're talking millions of pounds.
But the money wasn't real.
A huge portion of it wasn't. They were cooking the books. They've created these enormous debts on paper, often at usurious, insane interest rates, 20, 30, 40%.
So they invent a debt and then charge crippling interest on the invented debt.
Precisely. And to pay off these fake debts, the Nabob was given free rein to squeeze his own people. He had to loot the entire Carnatic region of India to funnel money back to these private British creditors, who in turn used that money to buy influence back in Parliament. It was a perfect circle of corruption.
And Burke's description of this in his speech is just, it's visceral. I have the text here. He talks about a gigantic corruption where the public revenues were being siphoned off. He describes the country being abused, insulted, racked, and ruined.
There's a specific passage that is just haunting. He's describing the aftermath of an invasion by a rival ruler, Hyder Ali, which had already devastated the region. He says the land was left as a monument of vengeance.
A wasteland.
A total wasteland. The people are starving, the irrigation reservoirs are broken, the fields are burned, and yet, amidst this total desolation, these British creditors are still showing up with their ledgers and their contracts, demanding their interest payments from a starving population.
He calls them relentless enemies. He says they are stripping the relics of the satiated vengeance of war. It's incredibly graphic language. He's furious.
So the question is, why does this matter for the French Revolution?
Right. What's the connection?
The connection is that it proves Burke defends the oppressed against arbitrary power wherever he finds it.
That's the connecting thread. It's the consistency of his principle.
Exactly. In India, the arbitrary power was a corrupt corporate monopoly acting like a tyrant. In Paris, the arbitrary power was the mob and the National Assembly acting like a tyrant.
It's the same enemy, just wearing different clothes.
Burke's consistent enemy isn't the people or the king. His enemy is unchecked will. His enemy is a lack of restraint, a lack of accountability, a lack of tradition and law to hem in the worst of human impulses.
So when he looks at the French revolutionaries tearing down the church and the monarchy, he doesn't see liberation. He sees the same kind of rapacious, unchecked power that he saw looting India. He sees a new East India Company, but this time it's wearing a revolutionary cockade and spouting philosophy.
Precisely. He sees people acting without the restraint of tradition, law, or morality. And that terrifies him more than anything.
Okay, with that context firmly established, let's get into the meat of the reflections. We've broken this down into 4 core arguments, and let's start with core argument number 1, inheritance versus abstract rights.
This goes right back to that initial fight with Dr. Richard Price and his sermon.
The rights of Englishmen versus the rights of man.
This is a crucial distinction, and maybe the cornerstone of the whole book. Dr. Price and the revolutionaries were arguing for the rights of man, these abstract, universal, metaphysical rights that everyone is supposedly born with.
You know, the right to choose your ruler, the right to govern yourself, the right to property, liberty, and so on.
And this sounds good to modern ears, right? We love the language of human rights.
Of course.
But Burke, being a lawyer and a very practical politician, asks a very practical question. Where do these rights come from? What's their foundation?
Where's the proof?
Exactly. If they're just abstract, as they come from nature or philosophy, then they're shaky. They're subject to constant debate. One philosopher says you have a right to property. The next philosopher comes along and says property is theft.
Who wins?
It just becomes a battle of opinions, a war of words.
Or a war of swords. Burke wants rights to be solid, to be tangible. So he makes this brilliant move and argues that British liberty is an inheritance. It's not a theory, it is an estate. And he uses this specific legal metaphor of the entail. Can you explain that for those of us who aren't 18th century lawyers?
Yes. An entail is a legal restriction on property. Yeah. Let's say you inherit a great country house from your father. If the property is entailed, that means you own it for your lifetime. You can live in it, you can enjoy its fruits, you can make improvements.
Why?
But you cannot sell it. You cannot break it up into smaller plots. You cannot waste it. You are legally required to pass it on intact to your children and they to theirs.
You're a steward, basically, a caretaker.
You're a life renter, in his words. And Burke says, our rights from the Magna Carta all the way to the Declaration of Right in 1688 are entailed inheritance. They are derived from our forefathers to be transmitted to our posterity.
So his argument is that if rights are an inheritance, they're as secure as property. No one can just take them away because they belong to the family estate, to the nation, across time.
Right. But if they're just natural rights that some philosopher dreamed up in his study, they can be redefined or erased by the next philosopher or the next mob who comes along with a more fashionable theory.
He says, we have an inheritable crown, an inheritable peerage, and a House of Commons, and a people inheriting privileges, franchises, and liberties from a long line of ancestors.
He thinks this gives a kind of gravity and permanence to the state. It makes the government feel less like an invention and more like a part of nature itself.
He talks about nature a lot. He says our political system is placed in a just correspondence and symmetry with the order of the world.
Yes, he believes the political system should mimic nature. Nature preserves the species even while the individuals that make it up die and are replaced. In the same way, the state should preserve its core institutions while generations of people pass through it. It's a partnership.
A partnership not just among the living.
No, that's the key. He calls it a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. It's a contract across time.
And this leads directly to his attack on what he calls metaphysics in politics. He really goes after the sophisters, economists, and calculators.
He despises what he sees as a geometrical or arithmetical approach to politics. The French revolutionaries were a perfect example of this. They literally tried to erase the old historic provinces of France, Brittany, Normandy with their own unique cultures and histories.
And what did they replace them with?
A grid. They divided France into 83 uniform, square-ish departments. They looked at the map and said, this is messy, this is irrational, let's make it a nice, clean grid.
They were trying to SimCity an entire country.
And Burke thought this was absolute madness. He argued that human nature is intricate. Society has complex, often contradictory goals. Therefore, no simple form of government, no simple solution can possibly be good.
He has this wonderful analogy about light refraction.
Yes, it's one of his best. He says that abstract rights, like the right to govern oneself or the right to property, are like pure, straight rays of light.
In a vacuum.
In a vacuum.
Yeah.
But when those rays of light enter a dense medium, like water, they get bent. They get refracted. You know, when you put a straw in a glass of water, it looks like it's broken at the surface.
Right.
Refraction. Burke says that when pure theory enters the dense medium of human passions, of competing interests, of a complex society, it gets bent, it gets refracted. And that's not a flaw, that's reality. You cannot apply the straight line of abstract theory to what he called the crooked timber of humanity.
So trying to govern by pure simple theory is like being angry at the straw for looking bent. You're ignoring the medium it's in.
Exactly. And he asked this brilliant rhetorical question. He says, is it because liberty in the abstract may be classed amongst the blessings of mankind that I am seriously to felicitate a madman who has escaped from the protecting restraint and wholesome darkness of his cell?
In other words, just because liberty is a good thing in theory doesn't mean you should cheer for the escaped lunatic running down the street with an axe.
Or the highwayman and murderer who has broke prison. Is screaming that you have to look at the circumstances. A government isn't a simple machine. It's a complex, living organism. He uses a chemist analogy too. He says just because a metaphysical chemist can separate elements in a lab doesn't mean you should dissolve a living society into its elementary principles just to see what happens.
You can't put the cat back in the bag once you've dissolved it into its chemical components.
You can't. You've killed the patient to prove the theory.
Which flows perfectly into core argument number 2, organic reform versus revolution. Because Burke isn't saying never change anything. That is a very common misconception about him.
It's the biggest misconception, and he's crystal clear on this point. He writes, and this is a crucial quote, "A state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation."
So change is necessary for preservation, like a forest needs occasional fires to stay healthy.
Precisely. He knows you have to paint the house, you have to repair the roof, maybe you even need to add a new room. He's a reformer.
But you don't use dynamite to fix a leaky faucet.
Exactly. The method is everything. He talks about approaching the faults of the state as you would the wounds of a father, with awe and trembling solicitude. You don't take a meat cleaver to your parent to cure them of a cold.
It's about reverence.
And prudence. He emphasizes relying on what he calls the general bank and capital of nations and of ages. This is his famous defense of what he calls prejudice.
Now, prejudice is a very dirty word today. It means bigotry, irrational hatred.
And rightly so. But for Burke, prejudice had a different, more technical meaning. It came from the Latin prejudicium, a prejudgment. For him, it meant the accumulated wisdom of the past that's embedded in our habits, our customs, our gut feelings.
It's a heuristic, a mental shortcut that saves you from having to think everything through from first principles every single time.
It is. Burke argues that an individual's private stock of reason is small. We just aren't as smart as we think we are on our own. So we should rely on the wisdom of the species, which is vast. Prejudice, he says, renders a man's virtue his habit. It enables us to act correctly in an emergency without having to stop and calculate all the moral math from scratch.
Right. If you had to logically deduce why you shouldn't steal every single time you walked into a store, you'd be paralyzed. You just know it's wrong because of this ingrained prejudice or habit.
Precisely. And the French revolutionaries were trying to strip away all those habits, all those prejudices, to build a society on pure, unaided reason. Burke predicted this would leave people with no compass to govern us. It's like stripping the operating system off a computer and trying to run it by manually flipping switches for binary code. You can't do it.
He also gets pretty nasty, personally nasty, about the people who were actually running the show in France at this time, the National Assembly. He looks at the roster of who these people are, and he is deeply unimpressed.
He is scathing. He absolutely mocks their composition. He says it's filled with country attorneys, pettifoggers, and obscure provincials.
Pettifoggers. I love that word. It sounds like an insult straight out of a Dickens novel.
It basically means a shady, small-time lawyer, someone who spends their life arguing over property lines and petty local disputes. Burke's point is that these men have absolutely no experience in statecraft. They've never had to balance a national budget or conduct diplomacy or run an army.
And suddenly you snatch them from their small towns and give them supreme power over a massive empire.
He says they are intoxicated with their unprepared greatness. He argues that because they have nothing to lose, no great estates, no long family names, no deep stake in the stability of the country, they have no incentive to be cautious. In fact, they have an incentive to destroy everything just to secure their own newfound importance.
He says it is easy to destroy an old building. Any idiot with a sledgehammer can do that. But it takes a comprehensive and disposing mind to preserve the useful parts and carefully add new ones.
And he accuses the French builders of being lazy. They're taking the easy, destructive shortcut because building is hard and requires wisdom they don't possess.
Let's move to core argument number 3, which is where things get really passionate. The pillars of society. This is where he talks about the nobility, the church, and what he calls sentiment.
And this brings us to the most famous, the most quoted, and the most controversial passage in the entire book. Maybe one of the most famous passages in all of political writing. The age of chivalry is gone passage.
He's writing about Marie Antoinette. He recalls seeing her years before when she was the young Dauphiness at Versailles, and he describes her as glittering like the morning star, full of life and splendor and joy. And then he contrasts that memory with the news of the mob breaking into her bedroom at the palace.
He writes, I thought 10,000 swords must have leaped from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insult. But the age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever.
It's incredibly powerful prose. But a lot of people mocked him for this at the time. Thomas Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft, they all basically said, Burke, you're weeping over the beautiful feathers of a rich queen while the people of France are starving. You pity the plumage, but forget the dying bird.
And that is a very strong, very powerful counter-argument. But if you look deeper at what Burke is doing, he's not just, fanboying over the queen. He's making a profound psychological point about what holds a society together. And that's what he calls the wardrobe of moral imagination.
The drapery.
Yes, the decent drapery of life. Burke argues that civilization relies on a set of pleasing illusions that make power gentle and obedience liberal. These are things like honor, chivalry, respect, manners.
The unwritten rules.
The unwritten rules. He says if you tear off these decent draperies, you are left with only the defects of our naked, shivering nature. You're left with brute force.
So if you strip away the symbols, the manners, the idea of majesty,
then a king is just a man. A queen is just a woman. And Burke adds, very darkly, a woman is but an animal, and an animal not of the highest order.
oof. That line always hits so hard. It's so brutal.
It is brutal. But his point is this. If you strip away the sentiment and the reverence that make people want to obey, the only thing left to make them obey the law is raw fear. If you don't have love and reverence for the state has to use the guillotine.
Which he calls the difference between regicide and homicide. To the revolutionaries, killing the king is just killing a guy. To Burke, it's killing the living symbol of order itself, and that is a much greater crime.
And this brings us directly to the church. Burke is obsessed, absolutely obsessed, with the confiscation of church property in France.
Right, because the revolutionary government was bankrupt, so they seized all the church lands to use as collateral for their new paper money.
They did. Burke calls them the philosophic financiers and mocks what he calls the finance of philosophy. He sees it as just bald theft dressed up in fancy language.
And he argues that if you can confiscate the property of the church, which has prescription, meaning ancient title, the oldest property rights in the country,
then no private property is safe.
Yeah.
If the oldest and most sacred property owner in the country can be robbed by a simple vote, then your house isn't safe. Your farm isn't safe. The precedent is catastrophic.
He even defends the monks. The revolutionaries called them lazy and useless.
Burke's response is so practical. He says, okay, even if they are lazy, their spending on their estates and on charity circulates money just as well as a rich guy buying luxury items. Their wealth wasn't idle.
And destroying the monasteries destroys libraries, schools, charity for the poor, and a source of local stability that had existed for 1,000 years.
And he sees a direct connection between this attack on the church and the rise of atheism. He talks about a cabal of literary atheists. He needs the philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot, who spent years undermining the Christian religion in France.
He believes man is, by his constitution, a religious animal.
Yes. And that religion is the basis of civil society. It provides the ultimate sanction for morality. If you remove the soft collar of social esteem and the ultimate check of religion, he predicts that people will eventually need to be governed by a severe despotism.
Which is a perfect segue to the final core argument we've identified, the economic and political critique. Because Burke isn't just doing philosophy, he's doing hard-nosed economic forecasting. And his forecast is incredibly bleak.
He looks at the assignats. This was the paper currency the revolutionaries issued, backed by the value of those confiscated church lands.
And Burke immediately predicts it's going to crash and burn.
He basically applies Gresham's law. He says this bad paper money will drive out the good gold and silver coinage. People will hoard the real money, the coins, and try to spend the paper as fast as they can before it loses value.
Which, of course, causes it to lose value even faster.
The death spiral.
Yeah.
And because the government keeps printing more and more paper to pay its bills, you get hyperinflation.
And he predicts it will turn France into a gaming nation.
A nation of gamblers. Because the value of the currency fluctuates so wildly from day to day, no one can plan for the future. No farmer knows what his crops will be worth. No craftsman knows the value of his labor. So industry withers, and everyone becomes a speculator. Everyone is just betting on the currency fluctuations.
The whole economy becomes a casino.
A rigged casino run by the government. And then there's the army. This, for me, is the part of the book that gives me chills. The prophecy.
This is the moment where Burke looks into the crystal ball. He points out this fatal structural flaw in the new French Constitution. The National Assembly has destroyed the king's authority. They've undermined the nobility, who were the traditional officer class. But they expect the army to remain loyal and obedient to them, a bunch of lawyers in Paris.
But why would they? What's the logic? There is no logic. The soldiers are being taught the rights of man. They're being told that all men are equal. Why should they obey an officer who is just their equal? Why should the army obey a committee?
The entire chain of command, which is built on hierarchy and deference, is being philosophically destroyed.
Burke writes that the army will become mutinous. It'll be torn apart by factions. The soldiers will start listening to their own political clubs instead of their officers. And eventually, in this chaos,
Here it comes.
Burke predicts that in the chaos of a weak democratic assembly and a mutinous, politicized army, some popular general who understands the art of conciliating the soldiery
Some popular general.
will rise up. And this general, Burke says, will become the master of the assembly, the master of the army, and the master of the whole republic.
He wrote this in 1790. Napoleon Bonaparte wouldn't seize power in his coup until the 18th of Brumaire, 1799, 9 years later.
Burke saw Napoleon coming a decade away. Not by name, of course, but he saw the type. He saw the archetype that the revolution was destined to produce. He saw that when you destroy all traditional forms of authority, kings, church, custom, you don't get a vacuum. You get raw power. You get the sword.
So let's step back for a second. We have this incredibly detailed picture of Burke standing in the doorway, blocking the path to the revolution, shouting, "You don't know what you're doing. You're going to create a monster."
And he was right. That's the profound tragedy of it. He was writing before the Reign of Terror, before the mass executions, before the guillotines were running 24/7 in Paris, before the Revolutionary Wars engulfed Europe, before the total collapse of the economy. He saw it all in the seed. He saw it in the principles.
Okay, let's pivot now to our thought experiment segment. This is where we like to take these dense historical ideas and test them out in a more modern or even a sci-fi context.
Right, in our usual disclaimer. These scenarios are for educational and entertainment purposes only. We're just stretching the logic of the text to its extremes to see if it snaps.
Experiment number 1. Let's call this the algorithm of prejudice versus the zero-day reset.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Set the scene.
Imagine we are colonizing Mars. We send 2 different colony ships, each with its own governing philosophy. Colony A is the Burkean colony. It is governed by an AI. But this AI has been loaded with all of Earth's legal precedents, religious customs, social habits, our entire history.
So it has the inherited wisdom of the species. It's got the entire common law database, all the sacred texts, all the etiquette manuals.
Everything. And here's the rule. This AI cannot create new laws from scratch. It's forbidden. It can only modify old ones very slowly, based on precedent and analogical reasoning. If there's a food shortage on Mars, it looks at how humans handled food shortages in the 14th century, the 19th century, the 21st century, and it adapts one of those solutions.
It uses heuristics. It uses that wounds of a father approach. Very cautious.
Very cautious. Now, Colony B is the Jacobin colony. It is governed by an AI programmed with pure, cold rights of man logic, pure mathematical reason.
The sophisters and calculators have built an AI god.
Exactly. And here is the kicker. Its memory of Earth history has been deliberately wiped. It's a clean slate. Every morning at dawn, this AI calculates the general will. It scans all the resources in the colony, scans all the people, and it redistributes everything to ensure perfect mathematical equality and justice for that specific 24-hour period.
A zero-day reset.
Yeah.
Every single morning. That sounds terrifyingly efficient.
It doesn't care who built the habitat module yesterday. It doesn't care about property rights from last week. The only thing that matters is perfect geometric justice today.
So the conflict becomes immediately obvious. In Colony A, the Burkean colony, you're going to have inequality. You'll have superstitions. You'll have some weird old traditions from Earth that don't make perfect sense on Mars.
Yeah.
But you have stability. You have inheritance. People build things because they know their kids will get them.
In Colony B, the Jacobin colony, you have perfect equality every single morning. But no one builds anything for the long term. Why would you spend a month building a better hydroponics farm if the AI might just confiscate it and give it to someone else tomorrow for the public good?
There's no incentive. There's no future. There's no past. There's only the tyranny of the present moment. And Burke would argue that Colony B collapses into a horrifying tyranny almost immediately because human beings need the drapery. We need the illusion of continuity, of property, of a future that connects to our past.
Without it, the AI or the programmer who designed the AI becomes an absolute despot. The zero-day reset destroys the concept of time, and Burke says society is a partnership between the dead, the living, and the unborn. Colony B has murdered the dead and sterilized the unborn.
Which leaves the living as just the flies of a summer, with no connection to anything beyond their immediate appetites.
Okay, let's do experiment number 2. I'm calling this one the ship of state sails. Imagine you own a beautiful, historic house. Let's call it the state. It's a bit old, it's a bit drafty, but it's been standing for centuries. You, the current owner, decide you're in debt and you want to throw a massive party for everyone.
The revolution.
To pay for the party, you decide to sell off the foundation stones of the house. You know, the church, the aristocracy, the old legal institutions. You start pulling them out and selling them.
Because you have a new theory. You believe the house isn't actually held up by the stones. You believe it's held up by the collective will of the people inside it. Gravity, you claim, is just a social construct invented by the old owners.
This is the abstract right argument in action. We can hold the state up with our minds. So you issue tickets to the party, let's call them assignats, and these tickets serve as claims on the rubble of the foundation you're selling off.
So the currency is literally backed by the destruction of the house.
Exactly. And the party is great for a while, but as you sell off more and more of the foundation, the house starts to crack. The floor begins to tilt. The roof groans ominously.
And what does the host do? Blame the engineering?
No. The host accuses the guests of not partying hard enough. He says, "You are committing treason against the vibe. Your lack of revolutionary zeal is making the floor tilt." He claims the cracks are being caused by the ghosts of the previous owners, the royalists, who are trying to sabotage the party.
So the inevitable structural breakdown is blamed on ideological enemies, rather than the simple fact that you sold the foundation of the house.
The question is, at what point does the right of the guests to enjoy the party get superseded by the right of the house not to collapse on everyone's heads?
And Burke's answer is crystal clear. The house has a right to exist that is independent of the current guests' desires. We are life renters, he says. We are temporary possessors. We have absolutely no right to cut off the entail and waste the inheritance of future generations.
If you sell the foundation to pay for a party, the house falls on everyone, the enthusiastic partygoers and the host alike.
And that is a perfect metaphor for what happened in France. The terror, the wars, the economic collapse, the dictatorship, the house fell.
So, bringing it all home, let's try to synthesize this. Why are we still reading this incredibly dense, passionate, 230-year-old book today?
Burke's Reflections is not just a defense of kings and queens. That's the surface level reading. At its absolute core, it is a defense of complexity against dangerous simplification.
It's the ultimate warning against the move fast and break things mentality when it's applied to human lives and societies.
Precisely. It warns that when you strip away the sentimental, non-rational parts of society, honor, religion, custom, majesty, all that drapery, you don't get a rational paradise. You get a slaughterhouse.
You get the abattoir.
Burke argues that we are just temporary possessors of our civilization. We have a sacred duty to the past and an equally sacred duty to the future. We are just one link in a great chain. And if you break that chain, you don't become free. You become lost.
So here's the final provocative thought for our listeners to mull over.
Lay it on us.
Burke wrote this before the worst of it happened. He saw it all coming, not from some mystical vision, but simply by looking at the principles involved. He ran the logic code of the revolution in his head and he saw the fatal bug.
The bug was the total rejection of history and human nature.
So the question for us today is this. In our modern world, we are obsessed with disruption. We want to reinvent everything. We talk about reinventing currency, reinventing gender, reinventing government, reinventing biology itself. We want to reset the system. We want that zero-day reset from the thought experiment.
We want to be the authors of our own reality, completely untethered from the past.
So are we too in danger of trading the unbought grace of life for a geometric politics? Are we building systems that look perfect on paper, that are perfectly rational in the algorithm, but that leave us in the end shivering and naked in reality?
And if we are, is there a popular general waiting in the wings for us too?
That is the question. And I think that's why Burke still scares us, because he suggests that the boring stuff, habit, tradition, reverence, prejudice might just be the only thing keeping the wolves at bay.
It's a heavy thought to end on.
That has been the Deep Dive, TalkTreatises edition. Keep those swords in their scabbards and maybe respect your ancestors.
And read the footnotes. They're always important.
See you next time.